Hi, this is Zibby Owens, and you're listening to Totally Booked with Zibby, formerly Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. In my daily show, I interview today's latest best-selling, buzziest, or underrated authors and story creators whose work I think is worth your time. As a bookstore owner, publisher, author, and obviously podcaster, I get a comprehensive look at everything that's coming out and spend my time curating the best books so you don't have to. Stay in the know, get insider insights, and connect with guests like I do every single day. For more information, go to zibbymedia.com and follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens. Meredith Turits is the author of Just Want You Here. Meredith's writing and interviews have appeared in publications including Vanity Fair, Elle, BBC.com, Electric Literature, the Paris Review Daily, and Bustle, where she was a founding editor. She graduated from Tufts University and attended the Yale Writers Workshop. She lives in Connecticut. Welcome, Meredith. Thanks so much for coming on Totally Booked to talk about Just Want You Here. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's still a little surreal.
Tell listeners what your book is about. Well, I'll put you on the spot really fast.
Okay.
Right out of the gate.
So I think of it kind of as a second chance coming of age story. It's about a girl named Ari. She's 28, has been engaged for a couple years to her high school sweetheart. They've been together for a decade, and the book opens with him breaking up with her. And she is left without a compass. She has no idea what to do, so she kind of blows up her life, moves to Boston, and quickly gets in an affair with her new boss. And then she gets very closely entwined with his wife. And so the story is sort of about finding yourself, trying to do as little harm as possible, and, looking at desire and love and kind of what we do to, find ourselves in that.
Love it. And we have the same editor with Carmen Johnson, who I love.
She's just the best. I think, the thing about Carmen is she really saw into the soul of this book, honestly, in a way that I hadn't yet. And the work we did just made it so much better and so much more real. I feel really grateful.
Oh, well, I feel like you did a particularly good, you did a good job with everything. But this feeling where your life is pulled out from underneath you, like a rug being snatched out, and what do you do when the world just feels so wobbly, and how do you right yourself? And sometimes you don't get up all the way, right? You make mistakes and you're, halfway there, but you're trying. And I feel like that's what makes your character so sympathetic, right? You root for her, even though she's doing things that maybe you don't necessarily think are the quote unquote right things, and that she doesn't think are the quote unquote right things, but we understand it. Right? Was that part of the goal, or tell me about that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for me, I'm really interested in these second chances. Like I was saying, you feel like your life is going to go a certain way and you are, ready to follow this linear path, and then everything kind of explodes and you have no compass, and the things that you thought were going to work out don't necessarily. And I think you have to really think about your life in a different way and take chances and kind of cross your fingers that they work out. And if and when they don't, you got to pivot. And so I think that was one thing that I was really excited about exploring with Ari. She thought things were going to, work out in a really linear way, and they absolutely did not.
Has your life taken a turn that you didn't expect?
I think so. I lived in the city. I thought I was going to be, the Brooklyn for life. I grew up in the suburbs, and I just got to a point where my life didn't fit there. And I moved back to the suburbs, like 3 miles from where I grew up. I live in Connecticut now, and just sort of didn't think I would be that person. And, moving away from the city, I figured out what my priorities were and was able to put my life together in a way that made a lot more sense for me. And I think, having that change and sort of being like, all right, I'm going to try something, we'll see how it works out. That was something that definitely, resonated with me in the book.
So I read that you wrote a lot of this at Sterling Library at Yale, where I have also done a bunch of work in the past. Tell me about that and your process of writing this book and how you got this done, and why now? Why did you decide to write it at this time?
So I had been working on a book for 10 years before this, and we finally went out with it and got this close to selling it and then did not. And it was devastating. It was, I put my heart and soul into this book. This was a story I had to tell, and all of a sudden it wasn't out there like we thought it might be. And so I thought about what was next. And while I was thinking, I had this story that I just sort of started casually writing, and all of a sudden it just took over. It was the only thing I could think about. And my writing process is very absorptive. It's pretty manic. I don't sleep when I'm writing, and I just got into this groove that I never had with the book before. And the draft came together in 6 months, which is just like mind blowing considering it took me 10 years to get the other one together. So I had a draft in 6 months. I sent it to my agent, but at the same time, I got into the Yale Writers Workshop, which is a week of really intense work on the Yale campus, which I'm about 45 minutes from. And I had, 10 people introduced to this character that no one had met before. And it was just so interesting to see them latch onto her and understand
Mm.
her immediately. And I was like, oh, I have something here that I just didn't have with the first book.
Wait, so what was the first book about?
The first book was about a very rough marriage. It was a woman who was about 10 years younger than a man she'd met, and he kind of brought her into this life that she really didn't want to live. She wanted to live in the city and, do young people things. And he was set on, working in finance in the suburbs, having a family, and she found herself really suffocated by this
Mm.
marriage that became abusive. And it was tough to swallow. And, the market was not super looking for stories that were suffocating and emotional and in ways abusive, especially right after COVID. And so it's definitely not the market forces. Like I stumbled over the book a lot. You can tell that in the prose when you go back to it. But it wasn't the right fit for me. It wasn't the right fit for the market. And then all of a sudden I had this new book, this new idea that I didn't even know would be a book. And just everything about it clicked in terms of timing and my writing and my process and the market. And it just ended up where it needed to be.
That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, I know everybody has a novel in a drawer, but like my novel in a drawer was like, that represented so much pain.
Yeah.
It's not just like an inanimate object. It's like, oh, look at all those hours that are now just like on these pages in my cabinet. Do you know what I mean? Like that was so much time, but you could never have written the next book had you not written the first book. So I try to remind myself of that, and I'm sure you do as well. Like it all works out, but sometimes.
It does. And I really believe in that. That book I rewrote from scratch 8 times. My husband is just like, you just keep throwing it out and writing it from scratch. Like, why don't you edit it? And I was like, no, that's just what I'm doing. And I must have written hundreds of thousands of words. And even actually before, the new project I'm working on, I wrote 200 pages of a new book. And I sent it to my agent, and she was like, this is great. It's not your book. And I plucked two characters from that, 100,000 words that I had written. And they're I learned about them
Mm.
through that draft. And now I have a fun draft I'm working on. And I think you never throw out words.
Hmm.
They just live in you kind of a different way, even if they don't live between the covers of the book, right?
Yeah. Although I'm always like, well, is there anything I could cut and paste to just like speed this next draft along? Even a scene, even like 5 lines of dialogue. And then I'll spend so much more time looking for a discarded 5 lines of dialogue that I could have just like easily rewritten it. But it's like the principle of the thing.
But that's fair too, because it's like if you write a line that sticks with you, like maybe it does belong in the new draft, right? You are like, oh, that's the distillation of the feeling that I want on the page. And maybe it's in a different context, maybe a different character is saying it. But like if that thing rings true to you,
Hmm.
like put it back on the page and see if it fits?
Yeah. So, what did you want to be when you grew up, when you were young? Did you always want to be a writer? Like, how did your life path take you here?
I think I was not one of those children who was like doctor, lawyer, astronaut. I was just always a writer. And I think as you kind of go through life and you figure out like, hey, that can be a career. I just kind of started following that path. I'm a journalist by trade. I started in digital journalism, in women's magazines like Glamour. I founded a website called Bustle, and now I am in sports business journalism. And I think what's been cool is that from a path perspective, I was able to just learn about myself through writing, and that was the right path for me, whether it was fiction or whether it's, writing about hockey, which is what I do to pay the bills.
So you founded Bustle, like the Bustle, like Bustle Media
Yep.
Group Bustle. Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Yes. It started in my studio apartment. Basically, it was a lot of right place, right time, fifth employee, first editorial hire. And I just remember sitting in my studio apartment in Park Slope, like resetting the router because there were way too many. There were like five of us trying to like build a website on it, and I stepped back and I'm like, oh, that was really cool to be a part of.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, it's grown so much, and to be at the beginning and shaping a content site like that, that's really awesome. Wow.
Thank you.
Yeah, very cool. I'm hoping that you didn't have a boss like, well, you were kind of the boss at the time, but have you had these types of experience, or are you drawing more from the Me Too movement in general? Not that it was that, because it was consensual, but I don't know, blah, blah, blah. Anyway.
I think desire is just what I wanted to mine. And I think in college it was, had this like weird emotional something or other with a man who was 14 years older than me. And it never went anywhere, but it taught me a lot about desire and kind
Mhm.
of things you shouldn't have, and how this like incredible feeling that burns is compatible and incompatible with something that is just not going to pan out. And I think it was really interesting to kind of pop inside Ari's head and be like, well, what if it did happen? And what
Mhm.
does permission look like? And what does longing look like? And how can and can't it live in your life?
I kind of want to know more about what happens to Morgan after the book.
Me too.
Like,
The funny
where did his story end up?
So the funny thing about Morgan is I was most comfortable inside his voice of the four voices. And he has the fewest pages. He only
Hmm.
has two sections. And I just spend so much time with him in my head still in the post-publication process because I love him, I connect to him, and I just didn't get a chance to explore. So, for me, I think it's really important that readers take what they take from the end,
Hmm.
including the path of Morgan. But like,
Yep.
I have the same questions. I really want to know what
Yeah.
happens to him too.
I think it was like the Cocoa Puffs that endeared me to him. Like, and how he was embarrassed to eat them in front of his friends. I mean, that's sweet too. I don't know. Very funny.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh. And I also, when I don't think this is too much of a spoiler, but I mean, I don't think it is, but when Ari goes to Morgan's mom, Kathy's funeral, and, she can barely stand seeing Morgan so upset, and she ends up leaving without saying anything, or, that wanting to do right again and not knowing the right thing, and not even sometimes being able to do the right thing, or socially appropriate or whatever, that moment, and also the loss of someone who was so important to her in her own life too, I felt like was such a poignant scene.
Thank you. And it's funny because I rewrote that a lot.
You
One of
did.
the things, yeah, one of the things that Carmen pointed out, I'm trying to think, she never went to the funeral in the first draft, in the draft that sold to Carmen. And she was like, that's not Ari. She wouldn't do that. And a reader wouldn't believe that she would do that. And I was like, I think you're right. And I think, Kathy was a mother figure to her. Her home life was bad. Her mother was so distant from her. She's not even named in the book. You don't even know what her name is. And I think thinking about this idea of what is right and doing as little harm as possible, and balancing sort of how you hurt or do not hurt others while taking care of yourself. That moment was really interesting to me because she was there as much as she could be, and it really felt more like Ari to do that instead of having her not show up, right?
Yes. I also felt the pain of her broken ankle and the surgery needed, and that whole mess very acutely as well. And honestly, the future sort of medical related stuff, which I won't go into, but all of that felt so moving and real, and you could like feel all that pain as well.
Thank you. It's funny. funny, I guess. It is what it is. But my mother fell down our front steps on Christmas Eve
Oh
a
no.
couple years ago, and she broke her ankle. And I was like, I guess I'm going to take this because I knew all the details of healing and all that. And it's funny because she is one of my earliest readers. She always is. And I was like, there's going to be something in here that's like a little familiar to you. And she got there and she's like, are you kidding? So that was taken from personal experience. There's not a lot in the book that is. And then I had an absolutely wonderful friend named Jinsey Thankachen, who is a cardiologist. She literally works with heart transplants. She's just like this incredible human being who actually read an early draft to make sure that, the medical stuff was believable. And even, Luke and Summer as doctors, that fell into place. And I think
Mhm.
I'm so fortunate to have these readers who are invested in drafts before they even, become books.
Yeah, that's smart. I know you mentioned Luke, how he's like on his feet 10 hours a day or something like that. It's like, I'm just thinking, wow, like it's not enough that they're geniuses, right? They also have to, like, I don't even stand up. I haven't stood up in hours.
My husband made me a like hack together this standing desk for me. He like bought a standing desk and kind of adhered it to my regular desk. And he was like, you are in front of the computer all the time. Like when I am not writing for my job, I'm writing fiction. And he was just like, you have to stand up.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, sometimes I'm like, my knees are cracking. I feel like I'm much, much older than you, but like, I feel like I'm now like the creaks and cracks. This is not good. Not good at all. So, wait, tell me a little more about your day job and the type of writing or editing and all of that you have to do. And how does that type of journalism inform narrative fiction?
So I currently am in sports business. So basically that's looking at like not like reporting on the score of the game. It's sort of like what is the sports doing to grow or what were the ratings or
Hmm.
who's hosting what. And so it's a really, really different part of my brain. And I think I have always considered journalism as a different part of my brain. I've kind of gone in and out of writing journalism versus editing journalism. And I think it's interesting because I think a lot of people are like, oh, you're constantly writing isn't exhausting. And for me, they've just never been the same thing. It's just, part of your brain A, and you turn off the journalism when you want to go to part of your brain B. That said, anything you put on the page, anytime you spend time with your writing or even anybody else's writing, you are constantly learning. So, even if I think from a compositional perspective, they are two totally different worlds, just that muscle and kind of how I was talking about, like you never actually like throwing out words. It just builds and builds and builds.
Did you have someone in mind? Like, was there a visual for you for some of these characters, like actors or actresses? Like, I'm thinking in particular of Leah and, what it is to be this like jilted wife, but she doesn't feel like some sort of dowdy wife that you would think of in like old, 80s literature, something like that. You know what I mean?
Like hot wife who's got her
Right.
own
Yeah,
stuff
yeah.
going.
Thank you. That's I guess I could have just said that.
It's funny because I am not a real like film watcher. Like I watch television, but everyone actually makes fun of me that they're like, "Oh, you've seen like insert classic movie here that literally every human has seen." And I'm just like, what's that? So it's funny because like these characters have always just been very visual to me outside of kind of, who people are on screen. That said, I think of Wells as like a Theo James. I loved Light Lotus, of course, and a little obscure, but Search Party. Of course, I can't think of the name of the extremely tall blonde character, but like that was Luke. And it's interesting because they are a lot more visual to me in terms of like somebody tangible in the outside world than the women. The women just like are fully formed to me and they just are their own people, which is interesting.
Wow. Yeah, I feel like I always have to have some sort of general reference point to describe someone. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
So, what advice do you have for aspiring authors?
I think it's important to examine the feeling inside yourself as you're writing. The best writing advice I ever got was from Meg Wolitzer, who a billion years I interviewed her for a publication called Bookslut that doesn't exist anymore. And we were just kind of casually talking. And one thing she said to me, and this feels so obvious, but she said to me, if you are reading back your work and you skip something on the page, whether you're like, oh, I've read this a million times, or, I know how the scene works or whatever, if you physically skip something on the page, the reader is going to do it too. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. And, I think about the 10 years that it took me to struggle on that first novel, right? And something just like was off and I had all these questions and I didn't know how to solve them. And then this thing came together in 6 months and I just was like, oh, there's a different feeling in me. And as I'm working on this new draft, the reason I think it's going to work is because there's that same, manic desire to write and continue to be in that world and tell that story that I had with Just Want You Here. And it's not just about production, it's about how you listen to yourself during the writing process. And you have to be really honest with yourself if something just doesn't work.
Yes. Good advice. Very good. Have you read anything that you love, or are there books that are some of your favorites or just recent reads that you could recommend?
So the best book I have read in eons is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. Just this masterful book that touches every literary device and every voice. And, I actually didn't pick it up at first because I was like, video games, not my bat and ball. And everyone was like, take it, pick it up. It's about relationships. And it was. So I feel, grateful to have picked up that book. I love that sort of like sad millennial women canon. So I've read a ton of Sally Rooney and Nisa Dolan. She gets a lot more kudos for Exciting Times, but I loved The Happy Couple, which I read, recently, and Megan Nolan also. I think there's a lot to learn from those books if you are a writer who writes a lot of interiority, a woman kind of at a turning point, because those like sort of girl walks around books can get really suffocating. So you can learn a lot from how to make people care about a character, even if not a lot happens.
Love that. That's really funny how you said sad millennial characters. I feel like I might need to make that a shelf in my bookstore. That's really funny.
And it's funny because so much of it is like Irish and British writing. And like, obviously there's a lot of like sad girl walks around books, here. But I don't know. There's something about it.
Would Sorrow and Bliss fall in that category? Have you read that? No? Okay. I don't know. Maybe she's too old. I don't know. Now I'm going to think about who I would put in that category.
That's funny. I mean, the other two books by American authors that I read during this process that I think really helped me were All This Can Be Different by Sarah Thankington Matthews. I thought that was beautifully done as just a look of like, what am I doing with myself? And I loved Acts of Service by Lillian Fishman, which I think should get way more kudos than it does, because as you're thinking about desire and interiority, that book just knocked it out of the park. So I think those kinds of books really appeal to me. I've read different kind of stuff. I just read Mad Woman by Chelsea Beaker, which I loved.
Yeah, that was
The Wedding People. I've not read something so funny in such a long time.
Me too. Love.
Yeah. But you think about kind of the books that like inform your own writing and you're just like, oh, there's definitely a theme.
I love that. Thank you. Good recommendations. Well, Meredith, it was lovely to meet you. Thank you for coming on, and congratulations on Just Want You Here. Congrats.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate it.
Okay. All right. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Totally Booked with Zibby, formerly Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. If you loved the show, tell a friend, leave a review, follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens, and spread the word. Thanks so much. Oh, and buy the books.